So I think we're all there, and let's go ahead and get started as time is of the essence. We're so grateful that you came to hear about oratory analysis. We, in particular, are very excited about oratory analysis. You know, when you put time and energy into something, you're creating something new, and you're excited about it. Well, that's how we are, and we hope to infuse some of that excitement into you as well. And I'm thinking that you're at least a little bit enthusiastic about it because you showed up. So thank you. My name is Matthew Shipley, and this is my esteemed colleague, Alicia Stunkel. We are both members of the Stoa Speech Committee, and so we were deeply involved in the process of soliciting ideas and input for new wildcards, taking all those different ideas and using the input that people gave to generate a couple of options. Remember the options on the ballot, and we were frankly very enthused about both of them, and we would have been thrilled with either one, and so we're thrilled. And so we're going to talk with you about oratory analysis today, and I'm going to start off with really what is the vision of the speech committee in regards to oratory analysis, because every new effort starts with a vision. What is it we think is going to happen? What is it we hope is going to happen through a new event like this? Well, first, as you know, oratory analysis, I think you know, is all about a student diving deeply into someone else's oration, right? And it's interesting, and we kind of wrestled with the term speech and oration and all that kind of stuff as we worked on this, because our competitors are going to deliver speeches about someone else's, well, what do we call that? Well, it's an oration, right? And the fact of the matter is, the original was a speech, this is a speech, the original was an oration, this is an oration, but just so you know, we're delineating between those two by calling the original an oration and the current a speech. Does that make sense? Okay, but they're both, you know, meaning pretty much the same thing. All right, so our vision is that students will have deep engagement with culturally impactful speeches. Now, students will be able to choose different kinds of speeches. We'll talk about that. But we are looking for them to select speeches that were truly impactful in their time. And that time could be historical, like from quite a while ago, or these could be contemporary speeches. Now, we will use the term history, historical, that sort of thing, but aren't we making history today? Right? And then today will be tomorrow's history. So we're not saying that it has to be ancient. Right? In fact, pragmatically, there will be some limitations on that. We're also envisioning that students will develop a good understanding of the content and the context of that original oration. So this is different from, say, just a recitation of someone else's work. You know, like you might read a poem and then that's it. Very different from like a cold reading sort of thing where someone else has written something and you just read that. Very, very different. We're looking for the students to truly understand what was going on surrounding that speech. What was the context? What was being said in that speech? Not just recite it, but understand it. The who, what, when, left out the where, sorry, why, how, all that sort of thing. We're also envisioning that the students will delve deeply into the rhetorical devices that were being implemented in that original oration and talk about those in their speech. We're looking for a real effective recitation and interpretation of the original oration. So this is an interesting one because if you really think about it, there are some elements of a platform speech here. There are also some elements of an interpretive speech here. Have you noticed that? Okay, so it's a really neat marrying of those two concepts. And when it comes to reciting and interpreting that original oration, that shouldn't be a monologue recitation. That should be a life-filled representation and interpretation of that original oration. Lots of shuns on here, right? Interpretation, recitation, oration. All right, and then ultimately what we're looking for is that our competitors will take what they've learned from studying great oration and apply those skill sets in their own speaking, their own speeches, their own oration. So, moving on forward.
Question?
Yes, sir.
So does that mean that it is a requirement that they recite the original speech as part of their analysis?
You are correct, sir. In whole or in part. Okay? So some speeches are quite long, right? And they're not going to do the whole thing, right? Some speeches are fairly short, and they may do the whole thing. But yes, this event inherently incorporates an interpretation, which is a form of a recitation of at least a portion of the original. Yes, Mark?
Well, I haven't read the rules yet, but what's the percentage? In a platform speech, you can use 30% of somebody else's words.
We are going to go over that when we go over the rules.
Right. We will get there. All right. So, moving on forward, the goal and purpose here. Now, this is on the document that you have in front of you. On the front page, you should have the ballot, and on the back of that ballot, you should have the rules, which includes goal and that sort of thing. So, I have it on the slide here, but the goal, as stated on the back of that sheet, is to move and educate an audience by showing insights into a historical or contemporary speech by focusing on the original speaker, time period, rhetorical elements, and societal effects of the speech. Now, I've bolded certain words there that are key words I want to draw out of that goal statement. To move and educate an audience by showing insights. Right? This is an insightful speech into a historical or contemporary speech by focusing on the original speaker. Who was that? The time period. When was that happening? What was going on? The rhetorical elements. How did they craft that wonderful oration? And the societal effects. What happened as a result of that? See, it's all part of the context. So we're looking for these competitors to dig into the backstory, right? The mindset and the motivation of that original speaker. So this is a bit of a character study of a real-life, true character that delivered this original oration. Also, the precipitating events and circumstances. What led up to it? What was the ramp-up to this oration that took place? And then what are some of the unique or notable rhetorical devices that served that orator's purpose? Because good speeches, good orations, aren't just a string of words, right? They're carefully crafted and skillfully delivered. And then also, of course, the impacts of that speech on culture or society. Because a great oration will generally have some impact, right? It'll make a difference somewhere and change things for people in one way or another. So, yes?
When you say rhetorical devices, you don't mean like alliterations and similes and...
We do. Those are among them. Now, I'll tell you, we kind of wrestled around about should we give like examples of rhetorical devices in the documentation, and we ultimately decided not to, because rhetorical devices, if you look up like what rhetorical devices exist in the world, the list is extensive, right? And so we specifically don't want to limit people's thinking on this by listing a couple of specifics. But yes, alliteration could be part of that.
There might not be a rhetorical device in the speech, though, right?
I would argue that every speech utilizes rhetorical devices. Maybe not some of the most common ones. You know, you might not have metaphors and similes and alliteration and rhymes and meter, specific metrics and all that. You might not have some of those basic ones. But there are rhetorical devices. And we want for the kids to dig into that because we want ultimately for the kids to be implementing a wide variety of rhetorical devices in their own speeches and to be cognizant of what those are. What is it they're doing? So, all right, so Alicia is going to do a walkthrough of some of the key elements of the rules.
Yeah, so what I have done is I have gone through the rules here that are on the back that I think most of you are turned to now, and I've highlighted the differences in oratory analysis versus, say, original oratory or an interpretation. So I thought we would go over specifically the differences that are in oratory analysis and what makes it so unique. So if we look first of all, we have our number one, our preparation rules. The competitor will prepare a speech on a single historical or contemporary oration. Again, that's where we made that delineation between a speech and oration. So something that is either historical or has been lately, because we're making history as we speak, right? In the written public record. So it needs to be a speech that is written, that we can find, and that we can verify, okay? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, which was not written by the competitor. So we want them studying someone else's work at this point, okay? So that's number one. And then a lot of this is pretty typical of what you'll find on platform speeches. And then we'll go down to number 6, okay? The competitor must provide a script and a citation page at each tournament, along with the completed oratory analysis script submission form. So we have put together a script submission form for oratory analysis by itself, because it does have some unique qualities.
Any more handouts?
No, I'm sorry. I've got one up here, but yeah. Oh, and then here's an extra one. So this means that it has its own script submission form to be completed for script submission. And then the original oration's verifiable date. And we went round and round as a committee about what is a verifiable date. And so we are asking that the student be able to confirm the month, day, and year of the original oration, because we want to know exactly in time when did this speech happen. Yes, ma'am.
What if it is a church father, or
Yeah.
I mean, the month might be difficult.
Yes.
Awful.
This was the conversation that we had.
Yeah, and one of our friends asked a question, which was great, because we put out an initial version of this, and then we got a question for clarification. And so, for example, what about speeches in the Bible, right? Well, that was kind of tough for us, because who wants to exclude the Bible? That's we don't want to do that. But we are looking for speeches that were clearly delivered by people at a point in history that's identifiable. Mm-hmm. And so frankly, speeches in the Bible aren't going to end up being eligible, because you can't identify a month, date, and year for that speech that was recorded in the Bible. We have nothing against the Bible.
I mean, church
Come
fathers.
on, preach that, brother.
No, I mean, like church fathers. Before the Reformation, there are many sermons that are written now that we study and read that were delivered.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so this was, again, like Alicia said, we wrestled not against one another, but wrestled with the issue in trying to sort this out. And there are many written things that are wonderful, but some of those written things may have been delivered orally as well. But we are looking for speeches that were recorded as having been delivered on a particular date and a particular circumstance. Because part of this, remember, is the context. What was going on surrounding that, and what happened as a result of that. This has a place of history, this great oration. And so if we simply take a writing, like, say, for example, my pastor, he doesn't preach from an outline. He scripts his sermons. And so I thought, he's a fabulous preacher. I thought, man, it'd be great to just put all those into a book, right? But without understanding what was driving that particular sermon at that particular point in the history of our church, you miss out on the context of it, right? So it's a valid observation. There are many wonderful things that are in written form that aren't attached to a particular location, date, time, speaker, that sort of thing, or maybe a speaker, but maybe not the others. Those won't fit in this particular category. But we will say that there are many that will.
But you are really limiting it to modern history then, or before the Reformation, really.
We've actually found speeches that date back to, what was it like?
Yeah, ancient. Really? We do have
Okay.
some that are
Where they're verifiable.
Yeah.
Granted, the scope of those is narrower the farther you go back, certainly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can you get close?
So I really like that you're going to be strict on date and time. That really helps to clarify.
Yes.
Thank you. Here's a question.
Yep.
Somebody recorded, supposedly, Constantine's speech before the army put those crosses on and they crossed
Yeah.
the bridge, right?
Right.
And not sure about the date.
Yeah.
I want to say, can't do it. Correct?
That's
Yeah.
correct. And again, please understand, please know we
I
wrestled
like
with that because we don't want to eliminate great things, and yet you need a bright line. And so that's where we start.
And that is sometimes the difficulty in writing rules that I'm sure we're going to talk about this afternoon in the speech roundtable is where do you lay that bright line at? And so we wanted something that was clear to the competitors and to you coaches to know exactly what the expectation was about that. So that was kind of the purpose. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So, if the speech is in a foreign language, it's not the original oration, but can we take the translation of that and use it, or does it have to be, I mean, when you say original, do you mean that it has to go back to, because I mean, that would also take out a large quantity of speeches as well.
You know, that's something I love about this business. Y'all come up with new stuff all the time, right? And so one of the things that I meant to say at the beginning that I didn't get said, so this creates the perfect opportunity to say it. There may be certain questions that are asked today that it would be unwise for us to answer without putting more thought as a speech committee into them. So I would love to have a volunteer, maybe somebody by the initials of Colleen Enos or something like that, to serve as a scribe on questions that we're going to need to follow up on. And I would count that as one of those because I don't want to give a flippant answer that's not well considered. So I think that's a great question. Speeches originally delivered in a foreign language that would have to be then translated. And I think that's something we would want to talk about
I agree
and
as
then
well.
give a good response to that.
Yeah, we don't want to make a quick judgment call.
We're not making rules here today.
Yes. Okay, so let's go on with number 6. So we talked about, and the original date and location must be identifiable. And we'll go into why the location is important later. But they must be included in the script, and the reference for the published text of the oration is required on the citation page. So again, we're going back to that written public record that we can find a copy of that speech. Kind of like we do in interps, where we have to have a copy of the interp, the original document. This is what we're looking for here. No audio or video sources will be accepted because we need it to be written. And then all sources must be cited in text and orally within the speech. So we're asking again for a citation page that has all of those sources spelled out. And then number 7 answers the question that we had. A maximum of 50% of the student's speech or the competitor's speech may consist of directly quoted material, which includes the original oration and any additional sources. So, maximum of 50% of any quoted material. Yes, sir.
Actually, it's not what I asked. What I asked was, do you have to recite the entire speech?
Right.
What
No.
this says is the competitor must include, at a maximum, 50% quoted material.
Yes.
Right.
And
She was actually answering Barb's question.
Yes.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. And so this says may consist directly quoted material.
So they don't have to quote.
They do have to quote the original, at least in part. How much of it they quote is up to them.
Okay.
But no more than 50% of their own speech may be quoted material.
Right.
They can also quote other experts' observations and views about that speech, but that's within the 50%. Okay? So, so again, because this is oratory analysis, it's not just, great oratory, right? It's also analysis of it. So at least half their speech needs to be their own analysis of this original oration.
Okay, so let's go into the presentation rules. Number 1, the speaker, place, and date of the original oration should be given early in the speech to provide the context. So they need to cite early in the speech what was the speech, where was it at, who was the speaker, and the date, so that the judge can hear that and know it early instead of midway through and they're kind of wondering what was this speech. So we want them to be clear for the judge. And then number 2, the competitor, this is this rule that we were discussing, the competitor must present all or part of the original oration and provide an analysis of the content and its societal effects. So they must do part of the original oration as part of their speech. And the second part of that is this analysis may be provided at the beginning, the end, and or throughout the entire presentation. So if they want to start with that original oration and then interpret it, they can do that. Or if they want to start with the analysis and then give it, or if they want to do part of it at the beginning, part of it at the middle, part of it at the end. This is entirely up to their creativity.
And we'll be talking about that in greater detail.
Yes.
So if you have questions on that particular idea, hold those, because we'll get into that.
Yeah. Yes.
So did I hear you correctly when you said earlier that they're to put themselves in, or at least interpret it?
We're going to talk about that in a
Yeah.
little bit as well.
We'll get to
Yeah. Okay, number 2, and that again has I'll present all or part, provide an analysis, and it can be at the beginning end. So that is pretty much all of the rules that are different. You can go through it, but pretty much the rest of the rules look like most of the other rules from events. So now let's look at the ballot, which is on the other side. And again, I have done the same thing here. I've just picked out the ballot pieces that are different than what look like on other ballots. Okay, so we have under content and reasoning, we have the first one is pretty standard to platforms about a thesis statement. And then the second one is identifies the orator, place, and date. So this is what we were discussing earlier, that they need to do that of the original oration so that their audience knows. And then the next one explores the historical context of the oration. And we're going to go into more detail about how to do that later in this presentation. But just so you know, that's part of what we're expecting them to present is the history behind this speech. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Up there you have original context. Personally, I like that better when you said it could be a contemporary or historical speech.
And
Is that something that could be
it's a
considered
good
maybe on here?
observation. The ballot does say historical, and I remember our conversations about that.
Yes.
And again, we are part of history in the making.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the attitude and philosophy here.
Yeah.
So it's the same.
Yes, it's the same thing. I must have written the wrong thing when I was ranking my slides, so I apologize. It does say historical on the ballot. Yes, ma'am.
That for community judges or judges that have not been to Stoa Academy, the use of historical context is going to be very confusing.
Okay.
I agree. Right, and I feel like a lot of our students that do contemporary speeches are going to be judged based on that word historical.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a valid observation. It's not a
Yes.
question, but it's an observation. Colleen, would you add that to our
Yes.
list? And that's stuff we can talk about.
Yes. Okay. And then the next one, understand the orator's purpose. Why did the orator write this speech and deliver it in the beginning? And we're going to again go into context about that later. Analyzes the cultural impact of the oration. So not only why did they give this speech, but then what was the effect of this speech? How did it impact maybe at that moment and then maybe even later? And now, how does it continue to impact us? So the cultural impact is what we're trying to get at. And then the rhetorical devices, because we really want our students to understand rhetorical devices and then how to use them in their own speeches. So we're hoping that by analyzing them, they're learning more about them and then they can incorporate them more naturally. Okay? So.
All right. So we're going to talk about some of these concepts in just a little more detail. Let's talk about the historical significance. And with respect to your observation about the word historical, we are, again, you wrestle with words because you need things to be clear, and sometimes the effects of using a particular word, a particular place, stream out and then start to affect other things. And so there was wrestling, and we'll wrestle more. But we're going to use the word historical right now because we're going to consider even yesterday being part of history. and last year. So in terms of historical significance, some of the kinds of things that students would want to be thinking about, and coaches as they're guiding students, this particular oration, was it at some turning point in history? Because you're looking for significance historically. Someone who, gave a nice little speech to, 30 people a couple hundred years ago, and it kind of had its moment and then it was over, it may be lacking some historical significance, right? So we're looking for students to engage with orations that had historical significance, either being like at a turning point in history, or did it mark some significant or memorable event of some kind, all right? So this is part of what makes it great is the time and place and circumstance in which it occurred. In terms of cultural impact, I'm going to be asking questions like, well, did it spark a revolution of some kind, or did it inspire great achievements? Right? What's the impact of this thing? Did it change the world in some way, or some portion of the world? Did it change people's thinking in some way? Impact must affect change of some kind, right? So if a lovely speech was given and everybody clapped and walked away, and so that was great, and nothing changed, nothing happened as a result, we might question the cultural impact of it, right? Did it really have an impact? And then one more concept. Obviously, we would desire that students would engage deeply with quality oration, right? Original orations or speeches that were very well quality. And what we're thinking of is, was it well written and well delivered? The oration itself exists in a greater context of historical context and the subsequent impacts. But the oration itself, was it a well-written oration? And was it well delivered by the original speaker? Yes?
About that, one that my daughter has in mind would not be like thought out for a long time.
It wouldn't be what?
Thought out for a long time. Well written. Mm-hmm. Could that be kind of subjective?
Well, how about conceptually we insert a word here, constructed, right? Well constructed and well delivered.
This could be something like a person's diary that they are not reading, but just their thoughts that they're saying in a public setting. Right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are certain speeches that have occurred at points in history that were kind of impromptu, but they were recorded, and they were great. That's fair game.
This one particular speech is about a woman who is about to be beheaded.
Okay.
I think that would.
So I don't know how much time she actually put into crafting the speech.
So the fact that I chose the word written here, now hearing your comment, if I could go back and redo this before talking to you about it, I would have chosen the word constructed. Well, because a person is going to construct their thoughts even in the moment, right? And so let's just mentally think about that as constructed, okay, and not try to box ourselves in.
It's not a ballot requirement.
But
we're just trying to give some guidelines.
Right. But do understand that ultimately that speech has to be in the public written record now, right? That's the clarification.
Okay, so again, just for clarification, it can be an impromptu speech that was given and somebody else recorded what the person was saying.
That's right.
And that would be within the construct of a well-written speech.
Right. Or a well-constructed speech.
Just as long as it's now currently in the written public record.
I think there's
and
more
then the thing well delivered.
Yes.
I guess my question would be, what if the speech's reception at the time was negative?
Mm-hmm. Like if people didn't like it.
I mean, right.
Yeah.
So
that's not an indication of how well delivered it was or wasn't.
Yeah.
And frankly.
So again, can they? What if the speech was badly delivered?
Mm-hmm.
Can they do a speech that was badly delivered and tell why it was badly delivered?
I think that would be fair game.
Open?
Again, remember what's on this screen. These are not rules.
Yeah.
These are ways of thinking as we talk about selecting a speech or an original oration. Mm-hmm. So these are thoughts that we have about that, but these are not designed to be limiting, right? The rules set the parameters.
Yeah, remember there's a reason why we keep rules as simple as possible in Stoa. So yes, exactly. And our membership is very creative, and we love that. Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of a speech given by Hitler, which may have had a great impact on somebody. It was recorded and written down, and one might say, well, that was very rough, gruff and negative, maybe even not well delivered, but it's totally impactful. Besides the problem of that being in German, and so that's still up in the air as to whether that might be allowed, right? Is that a rule we have not defined yet on whether we're doing original English or not?
Well, exactly, because that was not, because that's not something that we have wrestled with as a committee yet, because you guys are very creative, and it's hard to anticipate.
It's a valid question,
Yes.
excellent question. We're going to address it, it must be addressed. I
Yeah.
have my own opinions, but I'm going to hold them because I'm not speaking for Matthew.
Yes.
When I try to address something like that, we have to speak for the committee.
Okay,
Yes.
but keeping it to English, let's say
Okay.
somebody gave a very awful speech that was super impactful at some point. That at this point that's a go.
I
It
think
could be.
I think as well, like you have to leave it like the student. How well are they going to then defend it and talk about it and analyze it in context with what other students are doing? I think that also has to be considered. Yeah.
And when you think about this event, it's a competitive event. And so each competitor is going to want to select material that's going to be compelling to the audience, right? And so I think some of this will be self-resolving, because some kids are probably going to try some things that are pretty off the wall and go, let me give this a try, and then it's not going to go very well. They're going to go, why didn't that go very well? Well, it wasn't compelling, right? Or the original material was offensive, and people, reacted negatively to their own speech about it. That stuff will sort itself out, but there's not a rule that says it has to be lovely and happy and all that. There's no rule.
Which is part of the beauty of learning from other speech writers. What did they do well? What did they not do well? That's really what we're trying to teach, and how can we do that? Yes, ma'am.
I'm not exactly sure if this actually exists, but I'm thinking of like a TED Talk from Temple Grandin that it must be written down and not transcribed from the TED Talk by the student.
Yes, exactly.
Right. But in
Somebody else
today's
might
age,
have
and
already done it.
For quite a few decades now, we've had video and audio recordings of speeches. And if those have been transcribed in the public written record, fair game.
And published.
Yes.
In the public
Yes.
written record.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking about my student that won OI this year. She did Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. And that really wasn't a written speech beforehand, but somebody has transcribed that, and it's an incredible speech. So yes, exactly. Okay. So
Let's see here.
yes.
Speeches tend to get better, or they are assessed differently over time. So,
I think that would go in that cultural impact of how do we look at it differently now, maybe, versus how did they look at it then.
Was there more of a question, Dwayne?
but if it was a current speech, it's going to be hard to assess the cultural impact. This could be a really fantastic speech if it catches on.
That's something they could certainly do. There's not a rule against that. How effective that will be remains to be seen, because they're conjecturing now, right? And but I would say, there are speeches that have been delivered within the last few months that have been highly impactful, and we can already see the impact of those. So, okay, I think we're.
Yeah, so let's go back to these ballot requirements and how do we do that in a speech. Okay, so I think we've already talked about this identifying the month, date, and year, but we also want to know where was it delivered. It makes a big difference that Martin Luther King's speech was done in Washington, D.C. When I show my students all the people that were there that day, they're very impacted by the surrounding of that. So we want to know, well, where was the location? Like, we want to know, like, I'm thinking of Gettysburg, and that was powerful that he was there at Gettysburg. So that location is extremely important. And then context, what was happening at the time? We're going to go into some ways to evaluate that later. But really, what was going on when Martin Luther King gave that speech? Let's go back and talk about race relations, and talk about the people that were there, and talk about what was historical. When we talk about Gettysburg Address, well, we all know It was the middle of the Civil War, and people were dying, but a lot of people were dying, and these were brothers, and it was our country. And so we need to talk about what is the history and what is the context that was going on at that time, because we all know that what's going on around us has a huge impact on what we say. Even here at Stoa Academy, the speeches that we've heard very impacted by what's going on in our culture and in our society. So then purpose, and this often comes off in context. Why did they write that speech? What was important? What was going on? So when we talk about, I have a dream, why was Martin Luther King so passionate about that? What was his purpose? What was he trying to get across in that? So we really want students to look at purpose, because so much of what we do needs to go back to the why did we do it? So we really want them to understand, well, if I have a purpose and I have a passion and I have a heart for something, how do I communicate that? So, purpose. Cultural impact. We talked about this a little bit. What was the impact then at the time that the speech was given? And then also maybe how do we look at it now? Because as we all know, sometimes the impact changes with time and how we analyze it based on our glasses and our lens now of culture. Yes, okay. And then rhetorical devices. What were they, or what are they, and how are they used? So we really want them to be able to study those rhetorical devices, even down to alliteration and repetition. Because when you look at Martin Luther King and I Have a Dream, he was very repetitive. I have a dream, I have a dream, and there was a purpose in that. He really wanted us to understand his vision and to get that. And we can't really understand that if we're not understanding the rhetorical devices and why did he use that. And we want students to understand that so that it becomes more natural in their speech giving. Because as we all know, as we've read students' papers that are trying to learn these rhetorical devices, a lot of times it feels pushed and it feels not natural. So if they study these and they study other people who have used them well, then our hope is that they will learn to use them well.
So as a construct for students, I'm offering a simple way of thinking to be able to process these concepts that Alicia's just talked about. And that's the who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? So if they think in those ways, those are mostly W's. The who, right? For a student, think, okay, what was the story of that original orator? Remember, they're not just studying the original oration itself, but they're studying the story behind it. And that original orator is a character, right? Now, they're a real-life person, because these are real speeches, that real orations that really happened, right? So what was their story? And then what did they have to say? The who, what? The what is the subject and the message of the oration. That's the content of it. And then the when is the time frame of the original oration. That's part of the context. The where, the location, is also part of the context. And then where the really exciting stuff comes in, the why, the purposes and impacts of that original oration, which falls under cultural impacts and societal effects, and the how, the structure and the delivery of the original oration, which is part of the rhetorical devices. And I'll draw your memories back to the last presidential election. And after the primaries had happened and the parties had their selected candidates, and of course the two big dogs in the ring were Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. During that time frame, there was much observed and discussed about their very different rhetorical styles. I don't know if you paid any attention to that, but when you heard these two speakers speaking, vastly different approaches to public speaking. And they each had their own rhetorical devices that were just completely different from one another. And so, Hillary Clinton tended to speak in these long, flowing sentences, multi-part with conjunctions and all kinds of things. And then Donald Trump, right? You know, everything he said was like about 3 words at a time, you know, and so that's an exaggeration. So these are all part of rhetorical devices and the structure and the delivery style of that original oration. That's fascinating stuff for kids to dig into because each has their place and each has its own respective effectiveness. So, you know, when we talk about, well, could they choose a stinker of an original oration, one that was delivered poorly and structured poorly? Yeah. Will they want to? We'll see. What can they do with it, right? But our vision, which doesn't have to be totally limiting, right? The rules provide the parameters. Our vision was they'd be looking at great orations and learning from them. So.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. Would a song, I'm thinking of It Is Well With My Soul, so the songwriter had that personal experience. Would a song be considered a speech in this regard?
It's a great question, and the answer is no. Because it's not a speech that was delivered in a specific date, time, and place. Now it was written. Remember, the world is full of many wonderful things that have been written, either musically or in prose or in poetry or whatever. Those aren't orations. This is specifically about public speaking, oration. Okay, Alicia.
One more, I
Oh,
think.
sorry. I must have gotten off on my clicking.
That's okay.
All that stuff I just said there. All right.
Okay, do I have any other CC parents in here? Any other classical conversations parents? Matthew said I was showing my background when I put this in here.
This is her cultural context.
Yes, this is my cultural context. I've been a Challenge 1 director for 3 years. And so this is just a tool that students can use to evaluate a written work, any written work. And I think it applies extremely well to speeches. It was originally designed by Aristotle, and we are still using it now. And so it just kind of breaks it down into 5 common topics. We look at definition. Who or what is something? So in the state of, we look at Martin Luther King. Well, who was Martin Luther King? He was a Baptist preacher from the South. And that gives context into a lot of his other purposes when we understand who he was. And so definition says, and so we can also say, well, to what group does he belong? Well, he belonged to a different race than I, so we can look at that group, and that really impacted the way that he thinks, okay? So to who or what is, and then circumstance. What is happening at that same time? So what was happening at that same time in the South? What was happening at that same time in the country as a whole? What was happening in that same time in the world? Okay, so if we can help students understand that events are related, that it's not just what's happening here today, but what's happening here today is influenced by what's happening elsewhere. So it gives them that context, that they can look at the full context and understand it. And then relationship. What happened immediately before or immediately after? So what may have impacted that person writing that speech? What event? So if we go back to the Gettysburg Address, we all know what happened. We know that there was a large battle where more people died than had ever died. And so that really impacted Lincoln as he was writing that speech, or he was constructing that speech. So we need to think about what was causing speeches to be written. Comparison. How are they like? How are they different? So you could compare that speech to another speech, or you could compare that orator with another orator, or you could compare themes within that oration. So comparison would be a great one for them to really look at, why is that a good speech, and why do we still talk about that speech, or why are we still discussing that speech?
An interjection on that, though, because we did get this question as well. Can a competitor select more than one speech to analyze? And the answer is no. That's been made very clear in the rules. It's one oration, one original oration. So if they were going to do any kind of comparison, then they would need to make a reference to something else, and that might be familiar to all people or most people or whatever. But again, there's some risk involved there, because what if your audience is not familiar with whatever it is you're referencing? And this is not an analysis of more than one oration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
So a portion of a debate between two people like Lincoln and Douglas would be off limits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we're looking at Lincoln's speech, or what? So one particular speech. Yes. So good point. Thank you. And then what do others say about that speech? What have others said about the different speeches that you're looking at? Okay. So the 5 common topics is just a great tool to give kids so that they can kind of wrap their brain around what needs to be analyzed in literature.
So what we've done here is we've framed an approach to this this analysis of an original oration in several different ways, right?
Yeah.
We've done the common topics. We've done the who, what, when, where, why. You have it in the rules. It's structured in there. So these are just different frameworks of thinking, all leading to the same basic process of analysis.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
I was going to say before we move on, we had a question, but you had a comment.
Yeah, it's never our position to really teach you how to coach. We just want to give you some tools that maybe you can use as coaches, because we all know that you're great at what you do.
Has any other league, or not necessarily high school, but done this type of event that we could look for a video of it or something to show our students as an example? That's how I introduced, I think, motivational. The year, when we first introduced that, I looked something up and showed them. I said, I feel like this fits the bill, so they at least have kind of a picture. Is there anything like?
Honestly, I have heard that some somewhat similar kinds of things have been done, but I don't know of a specific example in another league that has done exactly this.
Maybe similar.
You might find some similar kinds of things.
Okay.
Certainly, you will find written analyses of other people's speeches.
Okay.
And you might even find people speaking about other people's speeches.
Okay.
But in a competitive context, like a speech and debate league, I don't know.
Okay.
This is for us at least. This is kind of groundbreaking. Now, are we just reinventing someone else's wheel without realizing it? I don't know. If you find
It's
it,
just
let us
always
know.
good to kind of give them like, this is, in this way, this is what I want you to do. Not this part, but
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see how it develops throughout the year. Yeah.
Actually, I'll send you something because I did find something.
Did you?
I just don't feel like it's the way it was delivered. But I'll send it to you.
Maybe not
see what you think.
Maybe not a good example, but an example?
Yes,
Okay.
because I
All
was,
right.
yeah.
Okay.
I'll send it to you.
Okay.
You can decide to share.
All right.
Yes, ma'am.
It seems like most of these things you're suggesting up there, right, but those are not on the ballot. However, it looks like authority would be under ethos. If we need to say something that others say about it, that would be more than just their own opinion, in their 15-year-old mind. And so it sounds like the authority is mandatory for the speech because you need to have a source, right?
But it's not mandatory that they quote other people quoting
so what would be
about
supporting
us.
sources then?
Well, that's what they would be.
Yeah.
So it's allowable, but not required.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Suggested.
Yeah. So it depends on the audience.
And then you said the comparison we'd have to be careful about that one.
Right, because you don't want to dive into a full-on analysis of a second oration.
Yeah,
That's
but you
gonna-
might want to compare some ideas that they put in the speech,
You could, but understand, we're not calling for that.
Exactly. But
In apologetics, if someone just rattles off a bunch of quotes, it's not going to do as well as someone who really demonstrates a deep understanding, right? Same in
I
expand.
think that's probably the
Yeah. All right, and we're going to be running short of time, so and we have
go quickly.
Just a little bit more here. And we did get a late start, and I talked with CJ about that fact, and so we have a little bit of grace, but that grace is mostly used now. All right, so understanding meaning and intent. The first piece we've talked about in pretty good detail. So there it is. It's circumstances that the orator was addressing. But let's talk a little bit about what did the orator seek to achieve. This is part of the character study when you're studying that orator. What was it they were seeking to achieve by delivering this speech or that oration? That's their intent. And then some other things about understanding their meaning and intent. Did the orator use figurative language, unfamiliar language? Sometimes in speeches, especially in today's world, people create new words in their speech. They make them up and they become a thing because of that speech, right? So it's all kinds of interesting things that can happen. And if they're using figurative language or unfamiliar language, maybe it's advanced terminology, for example, in California, Governor Jerry Brown introduced a word to the culture of California. Subsidiarity was the word subsidiarity. And most people have never heard of subsidiarity before. Well, now it's a thing because Jerry Brown talked about it a lot, right? And so, so what does that mean? What are they talking about when they use that language? And then lastly, what was their overarching theme and message? You know, every good piece of writing has a theme to it. Every good speech has a theme, and it has a specific message that they're seeking to deliver. And obviously, we want our competitors to understand that. Alicia's going to talk for a minute about cutting.
Yeah, so kind of like we do in interp when we look at a piece and decide what do we want to give. I think we had to do some of that with the original oration because we talked about that they must include part of it in their speech. So there are some questions that we can help them understand. What's important about this speech, either context or societal impact that they might want to include in their delivery? And then also, what is memorable? You wouldn't want to do, I don't think you would want to do an analysis of I Have a Dream without reciting some of that I Have a Dream because it's memorable. So those are some questions. And then what are the rhetorical devices? And maybe have them recite them. Again, this is just suggestions. It's up to the students and you to decide what parts that you want to include of it. Those were just some ideas that I had.
What about the acting? Are they supposed to?
We're going to talk about that in just a second as well. Yes.
As far as cutting goes, 50% total maximum. Is there a minimum requirement, or can a student get up there and give analysis on JFK's and only say, "Ask not what your country can do for you"?
There is not a minimum.
So they could only quote one line and the rest.
They could.
Okay.
Now again, how effective will that be?
Yeah.
Let's find out.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
So we can go on.
We're good?
Yeah.
All right, so I've mentioned a couple of times this concept that the original orator is a character, right? It's a real life character, but they are a character. And so when we talk about characterization, remember this is also an interpretive event, right? It's not just an analysis event, it's also interpretive. So they need to attend to the characterization. What kind of person was that original orator? And what do you know about their personality and speaking style? If it's an older one, then we may be doing a little bit of guessing because we may not have an audio or video recording of that speech. But sometimes we can even find things that describe their style and their mannerisms in the historical record. What do you know about their attitude and mindset at the time that they delivered that particular speech? Because you can have one person who can be at a certain place in their life where they're thinking in a certain way that's very different from how they were 10 years prior or 10 years subsequent. And so what was going on at that point in their life and their attitude and mindset? What do you know, if anything, about their physical or vocal mannerisms? We have, if you are looking at speeches delivered, for example, by Winston Churchill, he had some very characteristic mannerisms vocally and possibly even physically. Then, as you explore all that, really the question that I'd like to propose that your competitors think about is to what degree are they going to seek to emulate that original orator's attitude, style, or mannerisms when interpreting that original oration? Because they don't have to become the original, right? They can interpret it and recite it with their own spin and twist on it. They don't have to try to, if they're going to do Abe Lincoln, they don't have to, or, like the typical, interpretation of Abe Lincoln. They don't have to do that. So the question is, to what degree do they choose to do that, to become that character or not? And that's open. That is not a requirement. Moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about expression, emphasis, and cadence. Your competitors will employ expression, emphasis, and cadence when they are interpreting the original. Okay? The question is, how are they going to go about doing that? Well, regardless of whether they seek to emulate the original or not, or their imagined version of the original or not, right? Regardless of that, they are going to need to interpret it with appropriate expressiveness, right? Flatline deadpan isn't going to fly, right? So they need to be appropriately expressive. Now, I've seen, for example, remember cold reading? I saw competitors come in and take, a food review that was pretty dry and try to jazz it up, and they're jumping around and doing all kinds of stuff. It wasn't appropriate. It was weird, right? and so we have to try to be appropriate. Determining ahead of time which words and phrases will they emphasize, because they're seeking to draw meaning out of that original oration. So they're going to choose that. They're going to choose a speaking cadence. Is it going to be staccato, like Trump? Or is it going to be flowing, like Hillary? Is it going to be punctuated in some way? What is their cadence going to be as they deliver the speech? And is it going to be fitting for the speech? And again, will they seek to emulate the original, or are they going to use a different style of expression, emphasis, and cadence? That's their choice, and you can give them guidance as a coach. All right.
I'm just going to go through this quickly because we've kind of already covered most of this. I think it just kind of depends on the student as to whether or not they are going to emulate the original speaker or make it their own. But I think if they make, I think there's a certain amount of passion that needs to be involved, and they need to understand the emotion. And so that's part of delivering it, is them understanding the emotion and them making sure that they do that. So we can go on to the next one since we talked about it. So let's go back to putting it all together. We need to go back to that cutting. What did they think was important, okay, in it? And then remember, what are those ballot requirements? Go back to the place, the order, the place and the date, the context, the purpose, the impact, those rhetorical devices that they need to analyze, and then also the 50% rule. Remember the no more than 50%. I feel like we've talked about that.
We have.
Yes.
All right, so to put it all together, this is a piece that you had been asking about, and we said we'd get to. I want to make sure we get this in before we wrap up. And this is structuring the interplay between the interpretation and the analysis, because there are different models that can be used, and they will select whatever model they think is going to be effective, and they may tweak it during the course of the season. So, some questions to ask. One, to the competitor: will you start the speech with interpretation or analysis? It could be either way. There's no rule on that, and there's no cultural expectation. Will you identify the speaker, date, and place immediately at the beginning? Say, I'm going to speak with you today about such and such, blah, blah. Or are they going to give at least some intro analysis or interpretation first, and then come back and do that? They shouldn't do it deep in the speech, because the audience needs to know what it is we're talking about early in the speech. Yeah. Okay?
As far as the 50%, if they quote it and interpret it and then refer back to the lines, when they refer back to the lines, is that part of the 50%?
Mm-hmm. Repetition is allowable and may be advisable if they like that. But yeah, that's 50%.
They need to count it back
yes.
in. Okay.
Yes. Okay, good question. Moving on. So will you end the speech, right? Will you start it with interpretation, or will you start with analysis? Now, will you end the speech with interpretation or analysis, right? That's a choice they get to make. There is no rule. There is no league expectation on that. And then will you recite or interpret the selection all in one batch, or are you going to break it up into smaller segments and distribute it throughout your speech? That's a choice. And these are possibilities that they can consider. And then lastly, to your point, will you repeat any segments of that original oration? Will you? And if so, why are you doing that? We want them to be thoughtful as they construct this. So I'm going to leave that up because the last slide just says questions and answers, but we've had lots of questions and lots of answers, and we're pretty much out of time. So feel free to
wait a second. Sue, what did you want to?
Did you guys define interpretation? What interpretation means?
We've spoken a lot about interpretation. My suspicion is yes, but not knowing what you mean.
So in interpretation versus presentation, when you say interpretation,
yes.
You mean presentation of the speech?
We did talk about it. Not a simple recitation.
Okay.
It is an interpretation.
Okay, so we're talking full-on acting?
That's going to be, the degree to which they do that is going to be the choice of the competitor. And they're going to choose what they think is going to be effective, and then they're going to find out how effective it was or wasn't.
But there's nowhere on the ballot to.
They don't have to
comment on the acting part.
Right.
Yes. No,
Right.
exactly.
It's an interpretation. Yeah. Thank you so much. We do have those little half